Well, thank you very much. I must say I didn't know that I was supposed to speak about the German experience in this connection, because I don't really feel like a German. I either feel as a Bavarian, which is a little tribe in the south, or I feel like a world citizen. And I must say my involvement in this fantastic conference here today is really more connected with my role as a world citizen. I was very excited to be invited here because I've been following this field with great interest for many, many years. Always far behind my son Tobias Eigen, who some of you know, who always think that I'm a total illiterate as far as information technology and so on is concerned. But I have to admit that I was, even at a time when he was not yet born, I was already trying to follow exactly what office technology offers us in terms of data management and so on, in order to create exactly what we are still pursuing today. This is a more open, a more participatory, a more predictable world. Yesterday, I guess, was the Right to Know Day, and I'm very happy to see that in the newsletter, which Article 19 has issued to honor this Right to Know Day, there are 3 items praised as being particularly noteworthy and positive developments in the past year. The first one is IATI. They are extremely excited. They think this is the greatest achievement during the last year for the right to know. The second one, and I'm also happy about that, is the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. Some of you may know that I was a founding chairman of that organization. In fact, I was a chairman until last April when Claire Short took over from me. But some of my experiences at EITI may be worth sharing briefly with you, because some of the issues which have been discussed today, I think, are very closely related exactly to this question. How does information, how do data translate into actual changes on the ground? So in that sense, I feel, again, this is a very opportune moment to say a few words to this wonderful group of people here. The third item, by the way, which was mentioned in the Article 19 newsletter, is the Open Government Partnership, which has just been announced a few days ago by Obama and 7 other governments. And in fact, I should admit that I was a little bit involved in this because I was in Mexico the last about 10 days ago, and we spoke to the government to encourage them to participate in this open government partnership, which hopefully will again be a tremendous push forward. I should admit in all modesty that President Felipe Calderón was my student at Harvard, so and I gave him an A at the time for the course on corruption. So if he wouldn't have participated, I would have withdrawn his Master of Public Policy from him. What is so important about, in my opinion, this conference today is that it is a tremendous step to empower organized civil society. And of course, this is since I made this experience with Transparency International and with EITI on how one can help governments, how one can help the private sector, including the big multinational corporations, how one can help international organizations like the World Bank, like the United Nations, to overcome what at the time was a real example of failing governance in a globalized economy, that is global corruption, international corruption. This experience makes it extremely important in my life to support everything which can empower civil society organizations, and of course open data is exactly the area which can be a quantum jump for civil society empowerment and participation, as we have seen in the Arab Spring and other situations lately. So what I would observe from the meetings I went to today are basically 3 main points. I mean, one is that there has been tremendous progress I mean, if I look back, for instance, to my own role in the World Bank, and I was very pleased to hear this presentation of the World Bank representative of their really overwhelming resources applied to this concept. If I compare my own attitude at the time, just to give one example, we had a system in the World Bank to discuss the country assistance strategies for various countries, which were extremely honest. We would even make judgments about ministers, about institutions, about our own judgments on certain risks in the country and so on. At that time, I would have been totally against publishing this to anybody. I mean, this was highly confidential, and nobody was allowed to show this, in particular, not to anybody in the countries we were talking about. Now this is a total self-evident fact that in the World Bank you publish the country assistance strategies, you discuss them with the government, which means, of course, some editing probably, and some massaging and so on. But still, it means that, of course, you discuss as a source of development funding produced by the world community, which the World Bank is, if you want to discuss the strategy in a given country, whether you want to do more in agriculture, more in transport, more in education, more in other things, that you discuss this, of course, with the government. So this is absolutely clear, and I think one should in particularly praise Jim Wolfenson, the president from 1995 to about 2005, who was incredibly proactive and really helped to move the World Bank from the position of Saulus to Paulus as far as information technology is concerned. I myself made the experience, for instance, that when we tried to fight corruption, I was at the time the director for East Africa in Nairobi, and I tried to develop a system whereby, through transparency, we would try to bring more accountability into the governments, both northern governments, which were encouraging at the time their exporters and investors to bribe systematically in Africa, but also the kleptocrats within the African countries in order to protect their people against corruption, which was going on at the time. I was basically thrown out of the World Bank. I mean, I was told to stop this immediately. I was interfering in the internal affairs of our partner countries, and therefore this was contrary to the charter of the World Bank to fight corruption. And I later found out, of course, that the reality was that most member countries of the World Bank, with the very respectable exception of the United States, most member countries thought that corruption was quite normal and therefore was something one would have to live with and would have to allow, including the Germans, the Brits, the French, and so on. We all allowed our companies to systematically bribe foreign governments and decision makers to get the wrong decisions, to get wrong economic policies from them in order to sell them useless and over-designed and even damaging huge projects, which in my opinion are the main reason for the poverty and misery and violence and conflict in most of our countries in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and so on. So this was the situation in the World Bank at the time. So of course they didn't want somebody like me to develop a systematic strategy how to bring transparency into this concept, into this reality. And when I then left the World Bank and started here in Berlin to build up Transparency International, I saw very quickly a tremendous sense of hostility and fear of the establishment that increasing transparency worldwide would destroy, for instance, the capacity of German business to get contracts in the international marketplace, would make it very difficult for governments, for instance, to subsidize and support systematic bribery of German nationals all over the world. And this is why at the time we had to really struggle. And I must say the concept which eventually won the day was a magical triangle of interaction between civil society, government, and the private sector. It was this particular activism in a very complex and technically complex context which made it necessary to have a relatively non-confrontational approach. And this was an interesting discussion in our work group later tonight, because activism can be, of course, bricks thrown through the windows of McDonald's, and can be chaining to the factory doors of factories, or interfering with the fishing of whales, with the rubber rafts and so on. But it can also be extremely complex and technocratic interaction with the other actors. And I was interested to see today that this question came up a couple of times, whether indeed there was a possibility of achieving change if one relies too much on sort of donor-driven data, which are basically filling our computer memories, as has been discussed again in our working group later. The second point, which I thought was interesting, was to what extent the acceptance of the transparency concept as such has been practically universal. Whether you go to the United Nations, to the World Bank, to Siemens, to Telecom, to Daimler Chrysler, to Global Witness, everywhere in the whole spectrum it is recognized how important it is to create transparency. Of course, in a given situation, there's always a reluctance to give up certain short-term advantages if you have a certain piece of confidential information and so on. But generally, the idea that transparency is extremely supportive, not only to promote accountability, but also to promote efficiency and the capacity of participation of people in the areas in which we want to be helpful. This is very widely accepted. This is particularly, and this is the third point I wanted to make, rather well accepted in connection with the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. I mean, this is an initiative which has been started about 10 years ago in order to bring out the numbers of payments made by private companies exploiting oil and gas and minerals and other natural resources in developing countries. And whatever they pay to their host country was, in many countries, and still is in a number of countries, a well-guarded secret. I mean, what we heard today in the first statement here from our friend from the Netherlands about the blackboards in the schools, where they say this school received so and so much money and where is it and so on. This exists already as a attempt to approach transparency in this area, for instance, in Colombia, where in the cities where you have coal mines or where you have oil production and so on, you show the people how much in terms of royalties has been paid and how much of this has come back to the region. But it is incomplete. In Colombia, for instance, all the payments made as dividends for state-owned companies were not included in the system. So this is what the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative is doing right now. It brings together in a credible way, again through this magical triangle of multi-stakeholder working groups in the participating countries, and there are now about 35 participating raw material producing countries, and 12 of them are fully compliant. And in these countries you have multi-stakeholder groups which give each other credibility and wisdom and the technical capacity to define what has to be presented in reports, and then later certify these reports through, again, a process which is run at the global level through a secretariat in Oslo, which is controlled by a multi-stakeholder board, which I chaired until last last May. Now, the complaint we hear very often, and we heard something similar today in this room, was that this creates wonderful numbers, but the numbers don't feed hungry children, numbers don't heal sick women, and don't support the poorest in society. The numbers themselves don't help. And therefore, it is extremely important to manage these expectations well and make it quite clear that these numbers are just the start, are just the raw material, are the building blocks for the various activist groups which can use them and then use them as their tools in the political agenda locally or internationally and so on. So this is what we have been saying for quite some time, and I'm afraid the mandate of EITI is indeed quite narrow. It only produces these numbers. It does not say anything about the fairness of the, say, mining investment. It doesn't say anything about the environmental soundness of the operations, about the treatment of the staff, about poisoning of local rivers and mistreatment and human rights violations around the mines and so on. All of these things are outside the mandate of EITI. And it doesn't even say anything about the use of the money. $50 billion in some years have been collected by the government of Nigeria from the oil companies. $50 billion. This is nearly as much as the whole loan program of the World Bank. And yet this money is gone. The people in Nigeria are among the poorest in the world. So what do you do with this knowledge then? And then you create civil society organizations which breathe down the neck the government. Then you empower the parliaments to do their work. You empower the media to do their work and so on. So information itself, of course, is relatively useless. And somebody said today transparency is not a goal in itself, but it is a starting point. It's a building block in a holistic approach which eventually will create better governance. Not only more accountable governance, but also more efficient governance. So all of this makes it, for me, very clear how important this conference has been. And I have learned myself quite a bit, even though I had today to participate at an event where, from German colonial history, we had to see that bodies of Namibians who have been taken into the Charité, which is about 500 meters from here, by the colonial criminals who occupied Südwest Africa more than 100 years ago, how these body parts have been given back to a very impressive delegation from Namibia. So I missed some of your meetings here, but I have to say what I heard gives me a lot of hope that we are on the right track, that open data, and in particular open aid data, will be a very, very powerful field in which we will be able to bring the full power of civil society to bear, in which we will bring together civil society, private sector, government, international institutions, in order to create a world which is more fair, which is more just, which is more peaceful, and which is more sustainable, not only for us, but also for future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much. I have to add something that impressed me as well, is that you came to the Hack Day yesterday and you sneaked in and looked what we were doing. That was really nice too, so you had really an overview.
Yeah. I want to hack a little bit what you're doing.
That's nice.
I think it really does deserve a compliment, though, because it's not per se that the keynote speaker will be there and present for the remainder of the conference, and I think we've all really enjoyed having you here. And in case you heard us talking in the back, it wasn't because we were being unattentive to what you were saying, but just because we already started planning how can EITI, and especially the reporting structures from the ground up to the Secretariat, perhaps be improved through open data. So that was very inspirational, and I think also very motivational, your talk, because we tend to see, you know, the problems and how far we haven't gotten, but your presentation, I think, hopefully made us also all see how far we actually have gotten and what a journey through different working cultures this has already been and will continue to be. So thank you very much.
One moment. Looking at the clock, we are half an hour over the agenda, but are there questions, burning questions? We have time maybe for 2 to 3? Or are you said, I really got the complete picture, I can go out here and I think I know most what I need to know?
I think everybody's...
Wonderfully satisfied, I hope. That's great.
At least everybody understood what you were saying. That's the main thing, and can take the message home with them. So again, thank you.
Thank you very
yes,
much.
Birgan, I think, is the key word of the moment. So